Welcome to JGTCR, I'm Cope, and today we are tuning the Alpine A110 17. Let's get into it. In factory trim, this vehicle is very smooth to drive. It is not aggressive in any way, which makes it quite predictable. This Alpine has a reasonable amount of power, enough to have a bit of fun with, but not so much that we find ourselves wheel spinning. In fact, wheel spin is not really an issue in factory trim, so we can full throttle out of turns without the fear of spinning out. The suspension is a touch on the soft side, but works well with the factory setup and power. This means we can find ourselves experiencing understeer during turns, especially under heavy braking conditions. The overall package works well and can be pushed to its limits without being punished too much for any mistake we may make along the way. Let's collect our time at the finish line. 7 minutes 47.9 seconds. And now the tune sheet. With this setup, we have chosen to go with a firmer rear suspension. This is due to the weight of the engine at the rear, but more importantly because the wheels are set so far back on the chassis. The front is a touch softer for mobility during turns. A touch of understeer does remain up front, but does feel natural. Should this be an undesired trait, a touch of ballast or downforce up front of up to 15 points should remedy this. Let's test it on track. When completely modified and tuned, the Alpine A110 17 becomes sharp and aggressive during turns. The soft and sloppy nature of this vehicle is no longer present. With the firm suspension setup, it always feels like it's ready to respond to our commands. And when pushed, it can feel on edge, just waiting for the rear end to let go. When the tail does let go, it is easy to correct. A light lift, off and on the throttle, and away we go. It is at high RPM where we are most likely to get wheel spin and sloppy. So it's best to remain in the mid to mid-high RPM through turns and only rev out in straight lines after corner exits. The mild understeer we do experience can quickly shift to oversteer if we try and push through it. The best course of action is again to ease off the throttle, regain control of the vehicle, and power on. Let's collect our time. Six minutes 38.2 seconds. And now to the drift tune. For this drift tune, we have mellowed out the rear suspension, making it softer to give us more directional drift. We have also added more downforce and ballast. The differential has also been completely locked because drift. Let's get it on the track. The Alpine A110 17 is an adequate drift car. Not good, not bad, just adequate. Being that it is mid-mount rear-wheel drive, it tends to want to pick up speed during drift. And while our ballast and downforce settings have helped with that somewhat, it does tend to feel like it's trying to get away from us from time to time. This is mostly noticeable on high-speed turns or on the straights where it's not possible to dial in greater angles on the drift. The Alpine A110 17 truly thrives in the mid to low range drift speed. In this arena, it is stable and controllable. The drift transitions are fluid when inputs are smooth. Aggressive throws into drifts or transitions can result in the tail dragging us off track. This is due to the additional tail end weight of MR vehicles. The throttle response is decent but must be kept in the power band to maintain drift. This does mean staying at high RPM, which can be squirrely. However, this is something we can become accustomed to and adapt our driving style accordingly. And now it's time for an engine swap. With just the engine swap, the Alpine A110 17 is incredibly unstable. The tail consistently wants to wag the dog, and in most braking conditions, the rear tries to overtake the front. When it comes to power and power delivery, we are in a never-ending battle with loss of traction. If we do start drifting, there is no catching it if we try and power through. We must back off completely to regain control. It is best to stay in the mid to mid-high RPM unless on straights, as hard acceleration on corner exits forces major understeer. What this all comes down to is that this chassis does not like the engine swap at all, and in factory trim with no modifications, it just is not nice to drive. But alas, let us jump to the lap time. (7 minutes 20.7 seconds). Onto the tune sheet. In this case, putting together a decent tune for the A110 was a difficult task. Every adjustment we made to one setting seemed to undo the efforts of another setting. So in the end, we put together this Frankenstein setting, but at least it works, with caveats. Let's head back out on the ring. With the engine swap and all of the modifications, the A110 is very powerful. Unfortunately, getting that power to the ground to be effective is very difficult. The risk of the tail end stepping out is constant, and catching that drift once it steps out at times is almost impossible. We do still face the issues of the tail wanting to wag the dog and the rear trying to overtake the front. However, thanks to our tune, the effects are much more mild in nature. But even though we raised the height, dipped the nose, applied counterweight, maxed downforce and dialed in as much traction as possible, both front and rear, it has not amounted to much more than only just feeling like we are mildly in control. Oh yes, and let's not forget we also minimize the differential settings completely. When all is said and done, the engine and chassis seem to be a mismatch. And while we may make it work, it certainly is not a nice drive. Let's get that lap time. (6 minutes 22.4 seconds). Let's go drifting. The drift tune has come together in a more traditional way. The rear end has been softened in the suspension to give us more directional drift. Our differential is maxed and locked for predictability. We have 100 points of ballast up front to slow the drift, and downforce gives us greater control when positioning the vehicle on track. Let's head out to Suzuka. Kick the tires and light the fires. It seems as though we have found a home for the Alpine A110 17 with the engine swap. As a circuit vehicle, it may be lacking, strange and awkward, but as a drift vehicle, it seems to have come into its own. The copious amounts of power is more than capable of keeping the rear end lit up consistently. At low, mid or high RPM, this engine has us covered. Be it throttle modulation or baking up a storm, the choice is yours. The suspension setup is very stable, and even with the extra engine weight at the rear, we are able to hang the tail out in some amazing drift angles. Transitions are smooth and easily controllable, as is vehicle track placement. The only real issue we see is when bouncing off the rev limiter. This can cause the tail end to spin all the way around and lose the drift. But other than that, the Alpine A110 17 with the engine swap is perfectly suited for drift applications. And don't we just love to watch it cook those tires? The Alpine A110 17 is nothing to write home about in factory trim. It is well-rounded for what it is, but is lacking in most areas. When modified and tuned, it becomes more crisp to drive and is a great improvement all round. When engine swapped, it becomes a handful to drive and control. even with advanced tuning methods. Where the engine-swapped A110 really comes to life is in the drift arena. Here it stands out as a smooth and easy-to-control drift car, and this is quite a surprising outcome. And that's all we have for you today, so until next time, keep racing.